Olympus's best prime super telephoto lens is a 300mm f4, which comes in right under $3,000. For that price, you can get a 600mm full frame equivalent and some excellent glass quality that has some great features built in on this lens. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of primes because I don't like being locked into a single focal length, even if the trade-off is worse glass. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about a few reasons why this is possibly my favorite super telephoto prime I've ever used, and why I think it could be a great fit for some of you. Huge thanks to OM Systems for sending me over the gear to try out for a month, and as usual, I wasn't paid by them for this review. They have no say in how it turns out, and I'm returning the gear at the end of my loaner period. So let's start with the image quality on this lens. The image quality is fantastic and the best I have ever used for a Micro Four Thirds lens, hands down. I felt like the images that I was taking, I could push all my crops all the way up to the resolution limits of the camera before the glass quality would affect them. Meaning that on the Micro Four Thirds system, this lens will never be the problem. In all my experiences with it, I didn't experience chromatic aberration or any fringing, and I didn't experience any soft spots, and corner to corner, it was rock solid, even at its widest f-stop of 4.0. If I think through all of the lenses that I've ever used, I can't do an official comparison side by side, but I think this very well may have been the best corner sharpness I've ever tried in a super telephoto. This is rare to say, but I truly have zero complaints about the image quality of this lens, and I couldn't have been happier with the glass. When it comes to how the autofocus pairs with the native MFT mount, there were also no noticeable issues there either. As mentioned in my OM review last week on my channel, I did have some issues with the OM1 that stood out to me, but in regards to the lens itself being the problem, the focusing speed of the Olympus 300 was fast, snappy, and accurate according to where the OM1 was trying to focus. In regards to image stabilization, it has 4 stops built into the lens, which is pretty good by today's standards, but not amazing. The lens is slightly old now, so back for when it was built, it was probably pretty amazing, but today it's run of the mill. However, for most people using high-end Olympus or OM Systems bodies, the image stabilization actually winds up being irrelevant due to the higher image stabilizations of the camera bodies built in anyways and capped out at their max synchronized image stabilization. For example, the OM1 that I tested this lens with has 7 stops built into the camera body, and with this lens in particular, caps out around there. So in a case like this, the image stabilization of the 300mm f4 doesn't even get to come into play. I imagine that most people who buy this lens will also invest into one of the OM Systems higher end cameras since they're already paying $3,000 on this thing. Let's also talk about some of the build features on this lens, since this is where it really shines in my opinion. First of all, this lens feels really solidly built for an MFT lens. This lens is super light and I had zero fatigue when holding it in my few days of using it. Secondly, I love the lens hood that they built into this lens that simply slides back and forth to put it into place or remove it. It's super annoying to me to have to deal with lens hoods, and personally, I think that this is just a great simple feature that more super telephoto lenses should implement if possible. What I really love about this lens though is the focus clutch that they have on it. I've never gotten to use a focus clutch on a super telephoto lens before, and I'm not actually sure if one exists on another super telephoto lens, but I love the implementation of it on this one. Where I found it was really useful was in examples like where I would be predicting the area a certain bird would pop up at. So what I would do is set my focus manually with the focus clutch to that spot, then switch back to autofocus. When the bird would pop out, I would try to autofocus on it, but if the autofocus failed, I'd just quickly pop the clutch back and immediately be in the general vicinity of the area and only have to minorly tweak the focus to tack onto the bird. There are more ways in which you can use a clever focus clutch like this, and ultimately, I discovered that I really like this tool when it comes to wildlife photography, and I wish I could see it on more lenses. On a side note, this focus clutch is just really satisfying to use. I know it's not everything, but I think if we're honest, it always helps if you feel like a professional with the way a good camera and a good lens handles. And something about this focus clutch just really gets me into the zone of doing photography. So this lens has a pretty much perfect image quality. It has great autofocus response and has good image stabilization and some amazing features built into it. So why wouldn't you want this lens? Well, that's a great question. If you're an MFT user, I think with 2 exceptions, I'd buy this lens over any other that I've gotten to use. It's literally ideal in so many ways. So what are the 2 exceptions? Number 1, affordability. This lens is a little steep in price. Like I said, I think it's amazing in so many ways, but it is a little hard to justify an f4 MFT lens at $3,000. While f4 is normally a great depth of field for wildlife photography, when you're shooting MFT, it's roughly equivalent to an 8.0 full frame depth of field at 600mm, which isn't very great. Heck, the Sigma 60 to 600mm full frame that I reviewed earlier this year is a full frame lens that is way bigger and heavier and comes in at $1,000 cheaper than this lens and has an f-stop of 6.3 at the same exact 600mm full frame equivalent. So to put this in perspective, yes, with the Olympus 300mm f4, you are getting better glass quality and some better features, but you're also shooting on an MFT sensor, which is a much worse sensor than a full frame sensor generally. The way that I see it, this lens is a great buy if you are sure that you are wanting to stick with the MFT format for reasons of weight or even just keeping the price down on your camera body. But this lens shouldn't be a driving factor towards choosing the MFT format itself, because you still won't wind up with a higher image quality than on a full frame camera. Speaking of that 60 to 600mm, that's the other exception I would have to buying this lens. For me, personally, I really value the use of zoom lenses, and the further I've gotten into my career, the more that I find myself liking them. They allow me to be flexible in the moment and back out for wide shots when I need to, which makes for some really beautiful and unique, creative shots that sometimes aren't possible when you're so zoomed in on a prime. On this 300mm prime, it is better glass quality because it is a prime, but for some, the trade-off of losing the zooming ability just simply isn't worth it. To sum up, I think this lens is a great buy if you have the money and if you are 100% sold on being an MFT shooter. But if you're trying to make a decision between full frame, APS-C, or MFT, this lens just isn't big enough reason, in my opinion, to choose the MFT format. Also, if you need that zoom lens instead of a prime, then you'll want to subscribe to the channel below to hear my thoughts on OM Systems' other best lens available, which is more than double this price, but a really solid lens. The 150 to 400mm 1.25 teleconverter f4.5. The review will be coming out tomorrow on that camera. If you want to see OM Systems' best camera, the OM1, reviewed by me a week ago on this channel, check out this video here in the end screen, and I'll see you guys next time.